So years ago, I actually used to be into rock climbing. My buddy Andrew, who used to be a youth pastor here at KCC, he would take me outdoors climbing, and so we would go to like Sequoia or Kings Canyon area, and it was cool. We would spend like the whole day out there. It's good being outside in the mountains, and we'd climb all day, and then when we got to the top, we'd enjoy lunch together and just hang out. It was a good time. And you see, when he first took me outside, it was a different story though, because up until that point, I had only climbed indoors. There's a gym up in Fresno called Metal Mark, and it's an indoor climbing gym. And so all my experience had been there. And so we would talk, and I'm like, hey, dude, I just climbed like this route at the gym. It was like this rating, and he would always like be like, oh, okay, like that's not a real, like it says that, but it's not really equivalent to what it is like outdoors. And I remember we'd always like go back and forth about that. And then when I told him like, oh, I did this route, he's like, how about I take you like on that side, that rating outdoors? I was like, all right, cool, let's do it. And so he takes me, we go, and I'm all set. I got my gear on, we start climbing, and he took me on what's called a multi-pitch route. So a pitch is like a length of rope. And so he would climb up till there wasn't very much rope left. I'd let him know, he would stop, and then I would climb up, and as I'm going, I would remove the gear he put in the rock. And then when I got to where he was, then he would go. And so we would do that until we got to the top of the mountain. And I remember this is like a 3-pitch climb. And so we were on the second pitch. He was already at the top of the second. I'm climbing up the second. And about halfway up, I made the biggest rookie mistake. I remember I'm on the side of the mountain, and I looked down. Like, I should not have looked down, because the moment I looked down, this fear just came over me, because you're so high off the ground. It's unreal. Like, you think to yourself, man, if I fall, I am going to die right now. There's no doubt about it. And so I looked down, and I wasn't in the gym anymore. Like, this is nuts. And so like I said, that fear came over me, and I started to panic a little bit. And then I remember like anxiety, like it was crippling. And I had to take a moment and take a deep breath, because there's no climbing down. Like, there's no climbing down. You have to finish. And so took a deep breath, kind of calm myself. And then I finished that climb up, and I got to the top, and it felt great. Like, I felt like I had overcome that. And you see that, about a couple of weeks ago, we started this new series called Vibes, and it's all about the emotions we feel, and it's about keeping those in check so that way we can prevent them from controlling our lives. We don't want our emotions and what we feel to be the boss of us, and so that's sort of what we're talking about. And this week we're talking about an emotion that we feel, that everyone has felt at some point in their lives, or maybe some feel it like frequently or often, but we're talking about fear. All of us have experienced fear in some way. Like, maybe for you, fear has kept you from trying new things, or maybe fear has hurt some of your friendships, or maybe for you, it's created this script in your head that convinces us of things about ourselves that just aren't true. And so, real quick, just take a moment in your community group. I want you to use that feeling wheel that we've been using the past couple weeks. And I want you to think of this, okay? Which of these feelings do you have the hardest time dealing with in other people? And the second thing, what is something that scared you when you were a little kid that you aren't scared of now? The crazy thing about fear is that our ability to experience it is something that makes us human. Like, think about it. Fear comes from the fact that we can gather information and we can think about the future. So as humans, we can wonder, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Or what if X, Y, and Z? And that begins to create this fear inside of us. We begin to become afraid of the future and what could happen. And we are where we are today because the human race has been able to accumulate knowledge, and we build on that knowledge, and then we can project it into the future. It's why we've continued to develop and change and evolve as humankind. The same ability that allows us to fear also allows us to imagine. Like it allows us to have hope or even to dream, which are great things. So our ability to gather information and think about the future has two sides to it. It has the fear side and then it also has the hope side. And I think we all agree that the hope side is awesome, right? Like it's great. It's wonderful. We love imagining, dreaming, inventing. But then there's that other side. The side that comes up with all of those what ifs. And we all know the what ifs that make us feel crazy. They make our world shrink until our world is pretty much made up of whatever is making us afraid. Think about the last thing you were afraid of and how much of your day was spent just fixated on that. Like, was it a test that you had coming up? Was it tryouts? Was it an audition? Was it, I don't know, like what was it that consumed your mind because there was fear involved? You see, if you're anything like me, then it consumes most of your day. Like you're thinking about it. You're working through potential scenarios. You're planning out what to do, or you're planning out what to say, and you're planning out what you hope they do or what you hope they say. And that's what happens when that fear vibe takes over us. Our world gets really small and our world becomes the fear. But here's some good news. Jesus had a lot to say about fear. But the problem is when we tend to read these verses, we tend to isolate them. We tend to take them out of their context, out of their larger narrative. And then when we do that, it's hard for us to really accept what Jesus has to say about fear. For example, Jesus said, "Fear not." He said that. He said, "Fear not." In other words, when it comes to fear, just stop, just quit. And that's not exactly helpful, right? So today I want to look at a passage where Jesus talks to some of his closest friends about fear, but with a little bit more context. Jesus had 12 main people. These were like his closest friends, and they're known as the 12 disciples. And essentially, Jesus was not only their good friend, but Jesus was their teacher. Because to be a disciple is essentially to be a student. It's to be a follower of this teacher and to learn from them. And Jesus had a lot to teach them. And Jesus tells them this, okay? He tells his closest friends this. This is Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. He says, "I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves." Now think about it. Wolves are predators, sheep are prey. Jesus is like, you guys are the prey, and I'm going to let you loose with a bunch of predators all around you. You know, the ones that would normally like chase you down, the ones that you run away from? Yeah, I'm putting you right in their midst. And then he begins to get more literal. And he tells his disciples that they will also be arrested and they're going to be beaten. And to wrap it all up, he tells them, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Sounds easy, right? Not even. We tend to read the story and stop there, but when you look at it in its context, it's just part of a bigger story. You see, Jesus took his friends on a little field trip right before this conversation, and it's all connected. You see, they're in this boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and while they were there, Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, he wrote this down, or he said this. Suddenly, a furious storm came up in the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Jesus and his disciples they're on a small boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and without warning, a huge storm shows up. Now, here's the thing. This little Sea of Galilee, while it's not a huge body of water, when storms hit this sea, it's no joke. It's no joke at all. Like, you fear for your life. The waves are huge. There's lightning. There's thunder. There's rain pouring down hard. Like, it's a storm that no fisherman wants to be in the middle of this lake. It's crazy. And what is Jesus doing in the middle of all of this? While this storm is happening, while these huge waves are crashing, there's rain coming down hard, there's thunder, there's lightning. What is Jesus doing? He's sleeping. He's sleeping. Can you imagine? The disciples were scared out of their minds. Quite frankly, they're worried about their lives. They're afraid they're going to die, and their fearless leader is asleep. That blows my mind. So naturally, they wake him up. Casually, they head over to Jesus and they say, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." The disciples are frustrated. They feel alone, but most of all, they feel scared. And they want their leader to calm them down. But he's sleeping. And how does Jesus respond when they wake him up and they're like, "Save us"? He says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" I can only imagine the disciples' response when Jesus asked them that. Like, can you imagine? You're soaked. Your clothes are soaked because of the rain. You're probably freezing cold. And you're like, look all around you. Look at these waves. Look at the storm. But Jesus wasn't paying attention to what was in front of them. He was teaching them something. He was teaching them about fear. So he gets up. He doesn't panic, which is used to make kind of a point here. No matter how scary the circumstances, Jesus stays calm. And then Matthew says that Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves and they calmed down. And the disciples, they're amazed. They respond by saying this, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Then they thought about what they just saw. This is unbelievable. The wind, yes, the wind and the waves, they obey him. He spoke and they did what he said. Now they're not just amazed, they're afraid. Like, who is this man who can calm down a storm? He has such power, and he used it to take care of them. And he was never afraid. You see, in a moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear of the storm. And that's the point of the field trip that Jesus took them on. He was trying to show them that their feelings of fear didn't have to control them. It didn't have to boss them around anymore. To show them that there's someone bigger and more capable than whatever it is that they're afraid of. So back to the conversation where Jesus says he's going to send them out like sheep among wolves. Jesus follows up by saying this, "Don't be afraid." He says, "Do not be afraid of those who will kill the body, but cannot kill your soul." In other words, Jesus is saying, if you're going to fear something, fear the right thing. Fear God. You see, a storm isn't nearly as big as God is. And these dangerous situations that I'm sending you into, don't be afraid. Because they aren't as big as God. It's like he's saying, remember that boat ride? Remember that boat ride we had not too long ago? You were afraid of the wrong thing. And sure, you had right to be afraid, but didn't you know that there was someone with you who was more powerful than that storm? And Jesus goes on. You see, this is chapter 10, verses 29 through 31 in Matthew. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care, and even the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." You see, Jesus is saying God is paying attention to you. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than the sparrows. You're worth more than those birds. Don't be afraid. God has numbered the hairs on your head. Don't be afraid. He is reminding us and saying, you are valuable to God. You are valuable to God. Don't be afraid. God is close. He knows your circumstances. He's concerned with what's happening in your everyday life. You see, you're real. He cares about you, and he cares about what you care about. Don't be afraid. And when it comes to dealing with fear, this is a big deal because God knows all about it and is with you in the middle of it. But Jesus isn't done teaching them about fear. You see, they go on another field trip. Jesus had been preaching all day, and it was starting to get late. And the disciples were like, Jesus, we should probably send people home. Because there was a crowd who wanted to learn from Jesus. They're like, we should probably send people home so they can have dinner, they can eat and relax. And Jesus is like, well, how about we feed them? Which it's crazy because we're not talking about a small group here. We're talking about thousands of people. So it's like a lot of money to buy the food and the fish or whatever it is that they're going to be feeding them. That's a lot of money. There's a lot of stress and worry that comes along with that, right? And how are they going to make this happen? Jesus wants to feed thousands of people. How are we going to do this? So then Jesus gets this little boy's Lunchable, and he breaks it up among the disciples, and he's like, go feed everyone. You see, it worked. It worked. It was a miracle. Everyone got fed. But before they have time to stay and enjoy it, Jesus says, hey, get in the boat and go to the other side. I'm going to stay here for a little bit, and I'll catch up with you, but get in the boat and go again to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples are like, oh my goodness, like too soon. This is too soon. We just experienced a crazy storm. We barely survived. Like, are you serious? But they do what Jesus asks. And they get in the boat and they start making their way to the other side of the sea while Jesus remained on shore. And so, all night they're rowing and they're going and they're going. And at some point in the night, the waves start to get bigger and they're like, all right, here we go again. Here comes another storm. But this time when they look out, they not only see the storm, or they not only see these waves, they see a figure that looks like a human. And it's walking to them. And they realize, oh my goodness, that's Jesus. Jesus is walking on water. He's walking on those waves toward us right now. Matthew records that the disciples were terrified. They're terrified, like obviously. Like in fact, it even says that they thought they saw a ghost. But then Jesus says something that gets their attention because they had heard it before. He said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. This is Jesus trying to remind them of all the lessons and all the field trips that they had been on together up to this point. They saw miracles, they heard teachings, and yet still fear was in control of their lives. In fact, fear even controlled them after this field trip. And they remained fearful up until the point of Jesus' death. Like they were still fearful even then. When we fast forward to the night that Jesus was arrested, we see that the disciples abandoned Jesus. Why? Because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they stayed close by, they too might be arrested. And then Jesus was crucified. Where were they? They left because they were afraid that they too would be put to death. And then the next day, when Jesus was buried, where were they? They were hiding. They were hiding in a room because they were afraid. But then Sunday came around, and the women who had followed Jesus went to the tomb, and they discovered that his body wasn't there. And they went back and they told the disciples. So the disciples got up and they're like, we need to go to the tomb. We need to check it out. So they go and they see that it's empty, and they are like, man, someone stole the body. That's the rational response. Someone stole the body. It's not here. But then Jesus himself appeared before them, and they realized that he's alive. It's not that his body was stolen. He's alive. Suddenly, everything that he had said to them before, it seemed real. It seemed true, and it was believable. Suddenly, all the times he told them not to be afraid, it made sense. He could conquer death itself. He can handle whatever it is that they were afraid of. See, for the disciples who loved and followed Jesus, the resurrection wasn't just a nice surprise. It was everything. It made them bold, it gave them strength, and it put everything Jesus said about fear in perspective. The world was still crazy. There's no doubt about it. But because of the resurrection, the disciples and anyone who followed Jesus could put their fear in its place. It was like they finally understood the lesson from the boat. When all the things around them seemed so much bigger and scarier than what they could handle, now Jesus' words made sense. Fear not, I am with you. It took on a whole new meaning. And we know this is true because after the resurrection, the disciples came out of hiding, and they didn't run away from the authorities. Instead, this time, they're preaching to the authorities. And these followers of Jesus ended up changing the world. Why? Because they weren't afraid anymore. They weren't afraid of death. They weren't afraid of being put in prison. They started to live as though they believed what Jesus had told them over the course of their lives and their time together. They believed, fear not, for I am with you. They lived afraid of nothing because they followed a man who had died and came back to life. And all of a sudden, nothing seemed so scary anymore. Not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because God was clearly bigger than their biggest fears. So take a moment in your community group. 2 questions. Well, first, I want you to read Matthew chapter 10, verses 28 to 31. You see, this passage points out that God is a personal God who is always with us. And does knowing that God is with you in every situation change the way you look at fear? And number 2, have you ever felt like you could go to God with your fear and anxiety? Why or why not? So take a moment, pause this video in your community group and discuss it. The thing is, we all know that fear will always be a part of our experience. Fear is a part of what makes us human. It will always be there to some degree, but we don't have to live like fear is in charge of us and it's telling us what to do. You see, there's a guy named Peter who was one of Jesus' closest friends and one of those disciples that was with Jesus. And he was there with Jesus during the miracles and the boat rides, and he made promises to Jesus that he didn't keep. He told Jesus that he'd never deny knowing him. But when Jesus was arrested, Peter denied not just once, he denied 3 times. And Peter said he'd stay focused on what Jesus told him was going to happen, but then panicked when Jesus was arrested. And then Peter said he'd always be there for Jesus, but then he hid in fear when Jesus died. But after the resurrection, everything changed. Fear no longer controlled Peter. So he gave some tips about fear in a letter that he writes to the Christians who never had a chance to meet Jesus. And he says this: cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. When Peter says cast, he means throw. He means hurl. He was a fisherman. Like when they would grab and cast their nets, you would grab them and you would hurl them. You would throw them. And he's saying, we need to hurl, we need to cast our anxiety to Jesus. And these are active and intentional words. It just doesn't happen by accident. You need to be active with your fear. So when you feel anxiety, when you feel fear, when you feel worry, take it and throw it to Jesus. We throw our fears on him because he cares for us. Remember it this way: because of Jesus, fear doesn't have to be the boss of you. So here's what I want you to do. When fear becomes the vibe that begins to take over and starts to control how you act, I want you to do these 4 things. First, I want you to name whatever it is that you're afraid of. Like, you need to put words to it. You need to surround it with words so you can understand and you can name it and identify what it is. And then I want you to write it down. Like if you like to write on paper, grab your journal or whatever it is and write it down. Or maybe you're a notes person, like on your phone, grab your phone, whatever it is you do. I want you to write it down. I want you to be able to say, I am afraid of this. I'm afraid that if this happens, then this is going to happen. Like, you need to be able to write it down and name it. And then third, I want you to throw that fear to Jesus. And you do that, I want you to do that by writing it down. You can say something along the lines of, Jesus, I'm giving you my fear of blank. I'm afraid of all of that stuff I wrote down before, but those are the what if situations. Here's what I know is true. You care for me. And even though it doesn't always feel like it, I'm choosing to believe that you're bigger than any fear I face. Since you defeated death, you can handle my fear. I give it to you. Please replace my fear with confidence in you. I trust you. Like, hurl that fear onto Jesus because he's bigger than it. He's bigger than any fear you could have. And then the 4th thing, I want you to talk with your community group leader about your fear. Like, your community group is there for you. Like, it's an opportunity for you to be open, transparent, and vulnerable. So that way this community can encourage you, can pray with you, can pray for you, and can help you overcome that fear through the power of Jesus. So, 2 things, final things I want you to discuss in your group. What is one thing in your life currently that scares you the most? And number 2, how can this group help you cast your fears onto God? So take a moment, discuss that in your group. So as we wrap up today, I hope you'll remember that these vibes, these feelings, these emotions that you feel, they don't have to control you. They don't have to be the boss of you. especially fear. And they're never meant to make us who we are. They are, however, invitations to pay attention. So while we can learn from our emotions, we need to know that because of Jesus, they don't have to be the boss of us. And here's the final word for your group. Let's be bold and courageous enough to share those fears that we face with our community group. Together, we can help each other fear not. So if you would pray with me, and then you can wrap up your community group. God, fear is a very real emotion that we all feel. It's something that can cripple us, that can keep us from living in the joy that you have prepared for us. And so, God, would you help us to cast our fears to Jesus, knowing that you, God, are greater than any fear we could ever imagine. We know that you care about us, you love us, you are involved in our everyday, and you want to remove this fear from our lives. So God, help us to be open and transparent and vulnerable. Help us if anyone in this group is going through some fearful things, please help them with that. We know that, especially during this time, there's a lot to be going to you about in fear because of just what's going on in our nation. So and around the world. So God, would you help us to cast those fears to you? We love you. Amen. Thanks for hanging out with us this week. Hope to see you again next week. Have a good one.